Okay, hello and welcome to the Barcast. I'm your host, Nick Barr, for another special episode of Cards, The Power of Cards. This is episode one. The previous episode was a prototype episode, episode zero. And I can't imagine a better guest for this episode. David Cole is a Magic the Gathering fan. You're the person who introduced me to Reigns, the
Oh,
iOS card game. You just tweeted about some pretty interesting whiteboard card prototype that you're doing with your kids.
true.
And your workplace is a game editor that's card based. So welcome, David.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be on cards.
Do you ever listen to On Being with Krista Tippett?
Yeah, I haven't released recently, but I've listened to a number of fantastic episodes.
I was just thinking about her, and she always asks her guests the same question of like sort of an original spiritual experience in childhood, something like that. What was
Right.
your what was your like spiritual card awakening in childhood?
Cards. I think it has to be Magic the Gathering. My mom played Magic the Gathering with her friends. Yeah, she was a cool mom. Uh, I live in Silicon Valley, Bay Area, and so a lot of her friends were engineers, software engineers working, on tech. So I think there was sort of like a nerdy scene that my mom ran in general. So she was playing cards in like alpha beta era. And I think that's the moment where there were cards that were precious that I wasn't allowed to touch, cards that were valuable, cards that were traded, cards that like people would come and show off. They'd like come to our house and be like, look what I got. And so the aura for around cards, I think, really was cemented in Magic the Gathering. My mom also was, a sort of pantheistic, sort of neo-pagan. So tarot was something that was in the household as well. But I think that I'm sure that influenced me, but I think Magic the Gathering was one that really kind of gave me that the aura and the sacredness of a card.
It's funny, I'm thinking about my own experience with Magic, and the earliest memory I have of Magic, I think, is in the third grade. So I would have been pretty young. I guess that's like 9.
Yeah,
What was that around the same time for you, earlier?
that sounds right. It is blurry, but it's around that time. Yeah. It blurs into middle school when I actually
Yeah.
got more
Yeah,
into it
right.
myself. Right.
Right. I mean, my earliest memory is sitting in Mrs. Burns' class on the floor and actually similarly talking about Black Lotus, right? That's
Yeah.
what it's called, Black. Like, so I think by that time, revised or third edition was pretty popular, and I guess
Yep.
maybe sort of an order of magnitude more available. But there was still sort of like stories of alpha. Maybe someone had a beta card at school, and so you just sort of knew that Black Lotus and maybe a couple of other cards were just worth an extraordinary sum of money. And I think it wasn't, talking about the sacred for me. It wasn't like, I don't think I was thinking in that time like, oh, I could be a thousand heir if only. It was more just like,
Right.
some of these cards have enormous value. And even the Black Lotus sort of is a spiritual symbol.
Absolutely.
Yeah, interesting.
I was able to occasionally borrow my mom's cards, although she wouldn't be happy about it because I wouldn't treat them as well as she would. But I would roll into middle school with like alpha lands. Like maybe she might give me an alpha land that she didn't care about anymore. And so I'd be able to go like everyone has third edition cards. And here I am with like some alphas, thinking I was like cool, but it would be just a plains or a mountain or something. So it wasn't a Black Lotus, certainly.
I think the other thing about those early Magic days that I find interesting is reflecting on like the expansion packs or whatever they were called, where like they were so, I don't know how it's changed. What, or do you still play Magic? Are you like up to date with Magic?
No, I completely fell off after some time in high school.
Yeah. I just like, there was like the dark, and
Yeah.
there was one that was sort of Arabian Nights themed. Do you remember what the name of that was?
I think it was potentially literally just Arabian Nights. But that's that first wave of expansions are a lot of the cards that are burned into my mind from my mom's collection, like antiquities and
Yeah, right.
things from that period.
And I have this very like before and after Homelands. Like I feel like before Homelands, things were like
Yeah.
very weird, and they were like
Yeah.
other, and they had this energy to them. Like Arabian Nights, yeah, it's just like there's genies and like the style and aesthetic was very specific and almost like from an IP perspective, almost like unwisely different.
Yeah.
And then Homelands was extremely whack. I actually doubled down on Homelands for whatever reason. Like I had a Minotaur deck.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, Minotaurs are dope, red, blue, and like all this stuff. But like Homelands did suck. And then after that, they all sucked. I don't know. And they got samey in a way. At least that was my experience of it.
Yeah. I think for me, there was a mystery also with just there was a sense of world and place that I found in some of those older cards, like especially Antiquities for me, are images where like you could watch a motif spread across many cards and have a sense that there were these characters. And I'm sure that's carried forward into the future, but there's like specific places and like characters and like, contexts that I associate with that period that I think there's also an interesting aspect to that where there were a lot of cards that I felt repulsed by, or like I didn't like, or I felt like I like almost liked, and I was bothered that I didn't like them all the way. And those cards would often sometimes be the cards that lodged further into my mind because I'd like, I wouldn't, maybe I'd like be playing them because they were good mechanically, like they were powerful, but I was bothered aesthetically by them or something. So they'd sort of, those ones would actually maybe stick in me more deeply than the cards that
do you remember
more straightforwardly cool.
Now?
Yeah, there were there's like a set of cards. Do you know Amy Weber, the illustrator Amy Weber?
No.
She did a lot of stuff in that period. I think she might have even been one of the original artists in Alpha. But she did a lot of cards where you'd have things like mixes of abstraction and reality. So you'd have like abstract shapes sort of like mingling with reality, like I'm gonna butcher these, but like, like a time wall or something like that. And how do you represent a wall made out of time? Well, you have to start to break into, abstract shapes kind of merging with reality. And I remember that those kinds of images would sort of stick with me and kind of echo in my mind. And then another category would be like highly articulated muscles. Like often magic cards would have these like incredibly well defined, muscular shapes on these like various, like black cards. I feel like especially some of the demons would have these like very yeah. That bothered me for some reason.
I mean, I think I actually talked about this with Matt on the last episode, but I posted, I think, a picture of Living Wall. That definitely stands out to me.
Absolutely.
I think there's like maybe a fetus and a sack in this living wall.
Yeah,
it's a lot of fucking trouble for like an 04 wall too. Like, I don't know if this is what you're talking about with that sort of mismatch, but it's like some of these images and things have no business being at like Nightmare.
Yes.
We'll talk about Melissa Benson in a second. Nightmare or like Shivan Dragon, like dope illustrations, dope creatures, and there was sort of just like an appropriateness to them. And then you sort of had these odd ancillary things with either maybe odd mechanisms or just mechanisms that like weren't that interesting. And yet, they sort of have this outsized impact.
Absolutely. Or cards that you wanted to believe were good, and so you'd put them in your deck and you'd play them and you'd like try to bend your whole deck to support them, and it just wouldn't pay off, but you were committed to the like, this guy looks like he should be kick-ass, but it's not happening somehow.
Yeah, I had a long poison counter phase, although the poison counter art was really terrible, but I just liked the idea of sort of like leeching my opponent's life force.
Absolutely.
And I don't think I won any game. Yeah, I mean, the art in that era is just, we were talking a little bit before about Melissa Benson, who I think both you and I had like an affinity toward. And I just looked her up again. And she seems like she's still active. Her last blog post was like 2018 and she's doing commissions. And it was also just interesting, like you're reminded of these, I don't know any people like Melissa Benson. Like I don't know any professional illustrators who also like her interests are like neo-pagan, like Wicca. And like, it's not like she goes home and then like turns that part of her brain off. Like this is her passion and she does this in a lot of different facets. It's just interesting to think about like the life of these illustrators. I think it was nice. I mean, the illustrators were credited in really kind of large typeface. So they had their own. Anson Maddox, I think, is the one who did Living Wall. And like, that's a name I still remember partially at least.
Yeah, and there was a heterogeneous aesthetic, unlike a lot of other card games when you pick up, and you can tell there's sort of one uniform look. You'd have a range of abstract to concrete. Do you remember the card? I think it was maybe Stasis. I want to say it was a blue card, and it was like a fully abstract painting, or not fully abstract, but like very closely abstract. And it was so abstract relative to the other Magic cards that would bother me. That was like one of the things that would bother me about that card. It's like it's too abstract, but I did appreciate the full range.
Yeah, I do remember the card. I'll have to look up the artwork. Um, okay, so there was Magic the Gathering. Have you in your youth made a card game? Do you remember like the first game that you created?
Yeah. Well, we would make our own custom Magic cards. I think that was like the first entry
Wow.
point into that would be
Yeah.
to just like draw a Magic card on a piece of paper, and cut it out and like put it into a sleeve to make it feel more real with the real card in the back. So you got the real Magic back, right? And then you try to play with your own cards. Did you never do that?
We never, I don't think we ever made any Magic cards, which is interesting to think about. Like somewhere else, there's like this group of people who it doesn't even occur to them to make one.
Yeah, no, it was like it felt like a really natural thing to kind of imagine a dream card. And the way the little kid thinks about a dream card, it's like, oh, it'll be like a 40-40 with, and all these like fantastic elements and it totally imbalanced and everything. But that's how you begin to learn these things about, game design.
And were you writing lore, or like did you have those italicized like little comments in your cards you were making up?
Yeah, I think we didn't end up creating entire worlds. I think that was beyond the scope of our ambition. I think a lot of the time it would be pet characters. I don't know if you had characters you created that you would just draw over and over and over again, because I had characters that I would like, like be a potential superhero, like a Marvel character candidate, that I would draw in all sorts of places and just draw notebooks over and over. And, then I'd make a Magic card out of that character. So it'd often be like pulling in images or ideas or things we created from other media contexts.
Would you be willing to draw one? I have one in my mind that I could draw.
I haven't drawn it in a really long time, but I can try to give it a shot
if you're up for it. I'll draw my little guy. I think I only
this is good audio, right?
Oh yeah, really good.
Let's see if I can conjure this. It's actually a little shocking how quickly I can conjure this. Didn't realize. Do you draw regularly?
No. Do you?
I have spurts where I draw regularly.
Andy Matushak told me to watch the Double Fine adventure documentary, the sort of the making of the game. And just, I've only in like the first few episodes, but just like watching him in his notebook, just being a total fucking kid was just so awesome. I was like, wow. Because you just get it. You're like, I know exactly the mode you're in. And I haven't been in that mode in like 20 something years.
Absolutely. All right. We ready for the reveals?
Let me go first because
okay.
I don't want to kind of like get crushed. So this is me circa third grade drawing.
Yeah.
He's kind of like a frog magician prince. And like stroke by stroke, it's probably what, like 20 strokes, but it's a very specific sequence. It starts with like M, kind of the widow's peak M, and then the circles, and then kind of getting that hat behind his head. It's like a very important part of it. That was it. I probably drew him 1,000 times or so.
Yeah. There's you get into these like algorithms, right? I think the classic would be the S, like the cool S.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. And it's sort of like you learn this sort of rhythm that has a logic to it that you internalize and kind of repeat over and over. All right. So, Zoom background. There we go.
Oh, I can.
You
Yeah.
get him?
Yeah. Oh, very nice. Oh, yeah.
Jester would be the character name. So I think what you're seeing is the influence of Spider-Man and Spawn, right? So the kind of the cool eyes that those share. And I also have always really liked high contrast black and white, something that is still true today in like a lot of my work. So you get that in the character too. So
you mentioned your mom kind of having tarot and stuff. Does tarot also feel open-ended from your experience of it? Like, could someone add cards to the tarot deck, or does it feel very closed? And like, I'm just wondering, like, what makes a card system feel open versus closed?
yeah, no, tarot definitely felt close to me, but I don't consider myself deep into tarot in any way. I think I appreciate it in theory, and I appreciate a lot of the aesthetics of individual cards, but as a system, it's not one I think gone into the depths of internalizing.
Right.
I've flirted with making Enneagram versions of tarot cards because that is a system that is kind of Baroque and interconnected in a way that would suit itself to a system like this. And I think there's a good fit there, but I haven't finished any of those experiments. That was a tangent from your question, though.
No, I'm well, I mean, I want to get into that now, but I was just thinking about open and closed because, you know, you're someone who thought of magic as an open system, and I'm someone who thought of magic as a closed system. And there are probably some systems that are like uncontroversially closed, and then some that are uncontroversially open. You know, like one of the easiest things you can do is have a deck with a few blanks on it, right? It's like,
right.
Okay, I get it. I wonder what is the signal that it's like, this is a closed system. And I mean, Enneagram, I guess, is an example, which is, it's like, I depend on some system map that is self-contained and like needs no further.
Complete, right. In Magic the Gathering, right, you're of course accustomed to sets coming out that expand the cards, and also cards getting banned, like the Black Lotus, where you kind of have this sense of like cards coming in and out of play.
My like latest new interest, I guess, is internal family systems that also kind of feels like it wants to have some cards, because it has so much to do with sort of working with parts and getting to know your parts and asking questions of your parts. And I don't know, on the one hand, maybe that's just like a worksheet, right? I mean, like the book that I'm reading kind of has a list of questions to complete, and it would be much better if it was a worksheet with like a place you could draw it, like sort of a structured diary. And I can see that form factor for it. Cards are also interesting. I mean, I think the little dirty secret of IFS, and I think of therapy in general, is like there's what, like 30 problems that people have,
right?
Like, I'm terrified of getting abandoned, so I'll be the first to abandon. I'm terrified of causing conflict, so I'll do whatever it takes not to have it, including, you know, like,
right.
There can't be more than 50. I don't know. Like,
that is the thing that I think has shocked me about Enneagram, is that sense that it keeps explaining more and more and more the more I spend time with it, that I'm like shocked by how much you can compress into such a small number of situations.
Right.
It is the thing that I think all the people that I know that have gotten into it, I think often say that exact same thing about how much they can't believe just knowing the 1 through 9 type they have, is how much that explains about themselves, right? So there does seem to be a sort of at least it's a surprising amount of compressibility relative to what we assume before exposing ourselves to these systems.
Enneagram has some nice tricks too, that like with the wings and the pointers.
Yeah,
like
right.
It has a really good onboarding experience where like the onboarding experience is like you're a 5 or whatever, but then it like starts to expand in really interesting ways. Whereas I just did something. Have you heard of this is pretty wild. I don't mean to group it all together as if to say Enneagram is no more valid than something else, but here's something that's like, it's called oh damn, I can't remember what it's called. Someone referred me to it, and it's like completely just only based on your time and location of birth. So it's like purely astrological. And it produces this like map of you. And then the 4 types of people are like projectors, generators, manifestors, and then manifesting generators, and then maybe reflectors, which are like very rare. So 5 types. And does this ring a bell at all?
It rings a bell, but I couldn't tell you what it is.
Um,
But is there a piece of like complex software that kind of projects out through time that is associated with this? Or am I just reaching?
there's there's a website that you can access that tells you, and then has many upsells of like, you know,
Yeah,
unlock this for $29.99. But then there's like a bunch of free YouTube videos where you could watch. So I've kind of done the free assessment, and
sure.
I'll find a link and I'll put it up when it's there. Not that I'm endorsing it, but you know, I like that stuff. And it's a fine line, right? Of like naming the truth, and then also just like kind of swinging at things enough that there's something there for you. I think Enneagram starts to feel a little bit swingy for me. I haven't gone deep on it, but like, I don't know how much I believe in the entire map
No,
of like, you know,
definitely.
being adjacent to a 4. Like, I forget whether I'm a 4 or 5. I'm somewhere in that area. But like the wings start to feel a little bit like swinging, you know, spray and pray.
Yep.
And
Yep.
sometimes it works. Sometimes I'm like, oh, that kind of does make sense. But then sometimes it sort of feels a little bit like covering its bases. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel the same way about Enneagram. And with all these systems, you have to hold them at a slight distance, right? The question is whether looking at things this way produces interesting results or not, right?
Yeah.
Not whether it's the most accurate or the most systematic.
Yeah. I find myself falling into this. I'm catching myself because before I was like, there can only be so many things. And like, I have a distinct memory of having a difficult work relationship maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And like blaming myself because I hadn't categorized the person properly. You know, like,
Yeah,
this is a collaborator who, had I kind of been more steeped in personality, like I felt like I should have been able to vet that early.
sure.
And I remember thinking in the moment, like, there can only be 5 or 6 types. I think I thought there were much fewer. And I was like, I felt hopeful that at some point, like, I would be enough of an expert just to do it. But lately, I think I've swung more to the other end. And even though I think that there's a pretty small number of maybe like um, neuroses or sort of like reaction chain patterns to kind of do a Ken McLeod thing, like, I'm less confident than ever that I would be able to vet someone. Like, when you're hiring or when you're thinking about work relationships, have you brought these things to bear, and have they been useful for you? And if so, where do you stand on sort of the like, no, I think there's like actually sort of structured ways to vet this, versus like, man, people are complicated and you never fucking know, and we won't know until you do it.
Yeah, no, it's a really important question, I think, especially if you do want to try to bring it into a work environment. There's a lot of risks, I think, with how people respond to systems like this. I think using it in a hiring context is like not appropriate. I think it's basically irresponsible and like not even I don't think you could even realistically test in a way that would give you like reliable results. My experience with Enneagram is that the people who resonate with it often have to be above some level of self-aware before they can really kind of work with the
Right.
system. There's like a resistance to kind of seeing yourself in a mirror as nakedly as a system like that can demand of you. And it's interesting to expose people to it for the first time, because you do see a range of responses, and a not too uncommon response is, this seems so accurate that I hate it and I don't want anything to do with it. I did it in the same way that I think looking in a mirror too long can be
Yeah.
just a repulsive experience, right? So I don't think it's great to force people into a system like that makes them feel that way, especially in a work context. But I have used it extensively in a work context when there's a sense of we're all interested in this and we're all willing to talk about it in this context, and we're not gonna let this leak too much, right? And there probably were cases where we leaked it too much, but if there's a set of people who are really into those ideas, it can be a really rich way to try to work through issues. But I think of it, like I said, I hold it at a distance. And one way I think about this in general, when it comes to how much to take a concept seriously or a structure seriously, is I use color as an analogy in my own head, where, what can you clearly say when red becomes orange? No.
Mhm.
Does that mean that a word like red and a word like orange aren't useful? I mean, obviously those are useful words. So concepts don't have to be sort of like super clean divisions to become useful labels to start to look at things. And if you look at, if you're looking at a shade of white, for example, you often have to start to say things like, oh, this is a cooler white or a warmer white, right? And so you want to be able to invoke these concepts to actually capture some of the ineffability of some of these things, because you want to be able to shift away. Like, oh, it's white, but it's shifted a little bit towards this. And so I think it's like you want to combine and recombine these things and to kind of gesture at something you know to be ineffable. But I think without vocabulary and without frameworks, it can be hard to make distinctions that are fruitful. It can be hard to even talk about. If you don't have a word red, or you don't have the word warm or the word cool, and you're looking at a shade of white, it can actually be difficult to characterize why you prefer one white or another over another, right? So I think of it more in that kind of lens. It's a lens to look through and kind of see, but it's never going to capture the full reality.
I don't want to detour on this too much because I want to get to your whiteboarding prototype, but I guess this is a conversation I'm having with a lot of people. And I don't want this to get off the rails. If it's getting off the rails, just say off the rails. But like, I talk to a lot of people who are miserable at startup organizations now. They're know VPs of whatever, and their like job is almost entirely like HR and like interpersonal and intrapersonal dynamics.
Sure.
And for a lot of people, it's like that, it feels like that's taken over their job. Like, whereas maybe 10 years ago, it was like 20% that, now it's maybe 90% that.
Yep.
And, when you're talking about these kind of work environments for Enneagrams, like on the one hand, I'm like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if, there was a way to kind of yes and this trend, right? Which is like, instead of like bringing your, sure, bring your whole stuff to work, and we have like this system for understanding each other and like sort of guardrails, which is like, there's no bad types, right? But by understanding my own type and by understanding someone else's type, we will achieve a lot more understanding and all that. So like, I can kind of imagine like energy going that way, right? And then I can also imagine that being a fucking disaster, and like it will bump into the same problem that almost any of this stuff does, which is like work is inherently a psychic prison, or whatever you want to describe it. It is not an enlightened society, and so there's a really strong ceiling to the value these things can have, because they're ultimately going to bump into sort of the leaky container that houses them. Do you have like a stance on that? I mean, you're kind of alluding to it of like, hey, it has some value, but I guess I'm thinking about more contextualizing just sort of in this mega trend of just like what it means to be an employee these days and how much squishy stuff happens in those relationships.
Yeah, for sure. It's a big question that I've thought about a tremendous amount, because I was basically a full-time manager for 6 years, until a couple of years ago. So, most of my job was just coordination work, people management, relationships, not exclusively, but it was the dominant experience. And I really liked my job. And so I think in contrast to a lot of the folks that I talk to, and I have a consistent experience with yours, like a lot of people don't like those jobs. And I do think that, I think of management as a really profoundly deep discipline that is not one that is well understood. It's not, there's a lot of great management books. Actually, a lot of the best books I've read on management have the most atrocious business bookie covers that would repulse me in most other contexts. So there's wisdom there, but I do think that there is, if you just contrast that with engineering, for example, as like a discipline that is well understood inside of Silicon Valley, right? There's a tremendous depth, and we understand that there's a tremendous depth, and we understand that there's like, mastery way beyond, a few years out of college. But I find with management, there tends to be a sense that there's like management basics you learn when you become a new manager, but then there's not necessarily that much more depth that goes beyond your first year or two of becoming a manager.
Nice.
And I definitely believe that there is a potentially infinite depth to that. And it relates to, I think, the aspect you mentioned before of like, you've moved away from looking for these typed systems, and you're looking more and more at like the local, like the hyper specific, the very, I think of it as a very thick context of a situation, right? That incorporates like all of these local factors. Like if you're looking at a work situation, you're looking at two people disagreeing. Yes, they're disagreeing about a work conversation, but they're also trapped in a psychic prison, like you mentioned. And, there's all these different ways to look at it. There's people looking at if you're a manager, you're looking at somebody like, they have a career, but they're also like a personality, but they're also a producer of output. And I always want to keep saying yes to all these ways of looking at it and just keep piling on the complexity of, the real world, and keep wanting to keep mastering like these new ways of looking at it all, and not just looking at it all through all these lenses, but also trying to align them all, right? So, an organization, the psychic prison term, we're implicitly referencing images of organization, I assume, yeah. And so if you
Classic
think of
example
that,
of a horrible cover image.
yeah, right, with an amazing book inside. And so if you think about the role of a successful organization needs to succeed in all these different ways, right? It needs to succeed as a financial instrument for investors. It needs to succeed as a meaning maker for its employees. It needs to serve as to compensate people. It has to adhere to all these different domains of evaluation. I always think that personally, as in my work, I always get excitement out of inviting more and more and more of those onto the table, and looking for how they need to be kind of, I think of almost like a Rubik's Cube thing. You like rotate them all in a way where like you can create something that somehow satisfies them all, right?
Yeah.
And so in management, I am really excited to kind of go as far as people want to go, into what it could mean to have a manager in terms of, the blurring the lines into therapy, blurring the lines into, spirituality, but like I said before, I think there's like a big consent issue with like taking people there. So I think it has a dramatic effect on the work that people do. And so I think it has to be in bounds if you're serious about doing really good work. But yeah, I think there does need to be that consent perspective as well. So it's a delicate balance in terms of, I feel very strongly that there's a tremendous amount of depth, but I'm very hesitant to advance the cause beyond my own direct relationships.
Right. And also managers self-understanding to know where they can't help, right? I mean, I think you're making me appreciate that when I'm describing my miserable friends, and if you're a miserable friend who's listening, not you, but like, maybe implicitly there is an inability or an unwillingness to go into certain arenas that, a truly sort of ideal working relationship would be able to do. But, what infrastructure would be helpful and necessary for a manager to be able to be like, here are my limits, right?
Yeah.
That's not anything actually that that feels very new and fresh to my ear, of a manager being like, look, I want you to be successful. I want you to be happy. I want you to know that like, I don't feel super well equipped to, I'm the one who's not giving consent, right? Like,
right.
Like that feels interesting. We can leave it there, but just
I have one more thought on that, which is in the context of Enneagram applied to work. There's a lot of people professional coaches who work there, and books and stuff like that. One pattern that I've seen is managers telling their reports their type and just sending them like here's a basic description of the type that I identify with, and I agree with this description. And it's not, here are my weaknesses and here's where I'm going to be a terrible manager for you. It's like, here's where I'm going to be maybe taken aback by something, or here's where I'm going to need like space, or here's where I'm going to, and when I've worked with people who get Enneagram, I have found that kind of disclosure to be productive in that way. And it does limit the relationship somewhat, but I think it also clarifies the ways in which it's open to.
Yeah, it's a really good call. I haven't worked with someone who's done exactly that, but many people I've worked with have at some point had to basically been forced to like issue a memo of like, here's my API, like
how to work with me.
And it's interesting that by and large is crisis driven and not like upfront, right? And it would be so much cleaner if it was like part of the normal getting to know you package. It also gives a little bit of a hint toward the report of like, hey, this is invited, right? Like it's a good way of like extending something. It's purely giving information, which is rare that a manager gets to just be like, here. And it also doesn't require anything back, but that's a nice like move. I'd love to talk about the game you're prototyping.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Do you want me to give an overview?
Please.
So I was never know where to start. When I was 11 or 12, I played the Star Wars equivalent of Dungeons and Dragons. I was not a DM. I was not, good enough to run my own games, but I loved playing it. I had a great DM who didn't really care that we didn't always know the rules. And ever since then, I've like chased that feeling with my own children, right? I've wanted to kind of replicate that type of play experience with them. But I've never actually learned any of those systems, like Dungeons and Dragons or equivalent systems. And don't I don't savor the role of dungeon master. I don't like the idea of having to plan things and create a whole long elaborate adventure for people to go on. I'd prefer to just open up a box and start playing something and not have to like read a bunch of rules first. I like games that people can learn very fast, almost like learning as you play is my ideal when I'm trying to design a game. It's just like I think of the standard as like when people are like drunk and they want to play a game, but they have like zero interest in learning the rules. Like, can you make a game that's simple enough that you can teach it to them and they'll have a good time, while a little buzzed. Not that my children are in that state, but that's the kind of I always want games where like the pitch rolls right into playing, rolls right into being excited to keep playing, right? And so I've taken many stabs at trying to replicate my memories of playing a role-playing game with my children in a way that they'll kind of roll right into it and get really excited about it. And they're 9 and 5, right? So they're not going to be excited about rolling dice and doing math. But this most recent stab at a game like this is maybe like the 7th or 8th iteration in this genre. And the major idea that I'm really excited about is that I found 3x5 index cards that are whiteboard material. And so they're as small as index cards, and they're really cheap. You can buy like dozens of them, so they're not prohibitively expensive. They work with whiteboard markers, and they erase well and everything. And the premise is that you are going to draw cards that have labels on them, and then you have to like draw the drawing to like associate with the label. So if you imagine a RPG character, you might have a weapon and a potion and a pet. Let's say you draw 3 cards and they say weapon, potion, and pet. Then to create your character, you would just draw those things onto those cards, like the kids would draw their character by just filling in the blanks of those cards.
Right.
And then there's like a die associated, like, just any dice you can find in the house, or you can pick and assign 1 to each of those cards. And then we tell a story, and when you want to use, something on those cards, you have to roll the die, and then it's up to me to decide how the die corresponds to an outcome. And because they can pick any dice in the house, that means that they can pick all sorts of weird things that have like wild symbols that are irrelevant to the game we're playing. But that's kind of the fun interpretive act, is to kind of like look at the die and think about the item and then kind of imagine how it would fit the story. So there's not much structure beyond that. And so the idea is that you can kind of like keep erasing and redrawing drawings as like you have a sword, but then you break the sword, and so you erase the sword and redraw it broken. We just erase part of it. So the drawings are also living representations of like the game state, right? So they're kind of like the character sheet, but they're constantly portraying the current state of the character. And so it taps into like their drawing, they're kind of responding to prompts, as opposed to having to like work through kind of blank slate. Here's like a book of like 14 races and like 18 classes. This is just like you draw 3 or 4 cards, you start drawing on those cards immediately. I'm doing a similar thing where I'm drawing rooms and on cards. And so we're just like from the get-go, we're playing, we're creating, and then there's just this total openness, like anything can happen, but it's still constrained by these cards and these die rolls in a way that kind of still makes there's still the thrill of the die roll, where you get to kind of cast the dice and kind of get excited to see what the outcome is, right? So
it was super. I think the first thing that caught my eye when you tweeted about it was just the materials. So first of all, 3x5 index cards that are white. Like, did you just discover that, or is that something that you've known about for a while?
Well, I was prototyping with Post-its before that, because that felt like a really I would love the idea that you can just grab any material around the house and start playing this. And so I really wanted to believe that Post-its were the answer to this. But when you want to erase a drawing like on a Post-it, it's just a huge pain to take a pencil eraser and kind of like scrub on it and hope that the combination of the pencil and the eraser and the paper are going to like forgive that, right? And so I noticed whenever we were playing with the Post-its, there was a temptation to like X out an enemy, or like if the sword broke, to try to draw that on there.
Mm.
Like the kids always wanted to like redraw everything. But
Mm.
when you're working with pencil or working with pen on just a post-it, you can never update the kind of drawing to match what was going on. And so we tried things on bigger whiteboards, and like we tried chalk, to kind of try to play with how drawings could kind of show the current state. Um, but huge whiteboards are kind of cumbersome and not really a fun play surface. And so I was like, okay, man, what somebody should invent is like post-its that are whiteboard material. And I was like, wait, somebody probably did invent roughly that. And so I just went on Amazon and typed whiteboard index cards, and there was a bunch. And I was like really excited to discover this
Awesome.
product existed. And then I had a label maker laying around the house, and I realized that would be perfect for, putting on the prompts directly onto the cards. And the aesthetic of the
So
label
what's an
maker is
example
so
of a
fun.
label that you print? Is that like weapon, or is it
Yeah.
something? Okay.
So if you imagine an index card, on the top it says weapon,
Right.
and on the bottom there's like a little square for where a die can go.
Right.
And they just fill in the drawing in between. And so there's weapon or potion or pet or skill or secret, or you can keep coming up with these categories that form the characters.
Quick detour. So I just bought my very first label maker maybe a month ago. And I had like, I think fatherhood for me so far in month 7 has been like a series of overall like incredibly like positive feeling and richness and like happiness, punctuated by like crises and breakdowns at like varying levels of intensity. Like my first one is a doozy at like week 3 or something like that. Since then they're like very subtle so far, but like I had a really interesting breakdown. I'm saying like a little bit flippantly, right? Like not like not huddle on the floor crying. That was like my first one, but like things that maybe I don't even recognize as a breakdown, but like a decision to reorganize my bathroom.
Right.
So I just am never moved by these things historically, but like I was like, I'm gonna and it didn't come from I'm sure somewhere in there was like a sense of like I don't control anything anymore, so it let me at least control this bathroom. But it didn't feel that like it didn't have that much heat. It really felt like I've got an idea, and I really don't like all the visual noise anywhere, but especially not the bathroom, where it's like a Garnier Fructis bottle with its like nasty green color and it's like text everywhere. So I just basically got very plain bottles and then a label maker where it's like shampoo and soap and stuff like that, and extremely happy with it. And now my bathroom is like a joy, and I'm just not that kind of person. So the label maker has been great. And there's something so joyous about the process of making labels. Like I have that little scissors at the end. It's just really like magnificent.
It is. Yeah. There's a lot of great tactile experiences all along the path there.
But I want to ask about the DMing thing too. So like you're now DMing, and you said like you traditionally haven't had any interest in that. It kind of seems like this feels almost harder to DM because maybe you're really like almost clean slate DMing. So is that better because if your audience is your kids as opposed to like drunk friends, or have you also kind of found constraints and ways to make the DMing experience like more pleasant?
Yeah, so the DMing experience is something I'm still working on most now, relative to the play side. And so far it works in a similar way where like I'll draw cards and they'll have prompts on them. So if you imagine a kind of classic dungeon type adventure where you kind of descend through a dungeon and beat a boss and get some treasure as a kind of archetypal one to work with, I might draw a card that says like, obstacle, or I might draw a card that says, enemy, or a card that says mini boss or something like that, right? And so I'm also kind of responding to prompts in a way that makes it easier for me to generate a world as opposed to the kind of blank canvas side of it. But I am also playing with GPT-3 as a way to kind of further offload my responsibility to come up with something creative. So you can imagine feeding GPT-3 something like, oh, this is the story of an adventure where they, overcame blank, and then GPT-3 gives me something to fill in the blank, and then I have to draw that onto the card or something like that, to even further depressurize. Then you asked about the kind of, I think, the play experience, like how do you adjudicate such a free form thing? Isn't that like more stressful, right? And my kids are so young that I think they love it. They love for it to just get weird and wild. Like
Yeah.
they're not the kind of people to be like, wait a minute, you said that swords only do, they're not gonna
Right.
rule lawyer. They're still playful enough and joyous enough that like
Yeah.
they'd much rather have a kind of like sloppy mess than something that's clear and consistent. So there's just such a low standard for what it means to um, respond to a die roll in a way that's
Yeah.
systematic or something like that.
I have kind of like, I think this is a real question, but it's, I'm gonna just blunder my way through it and then we'll see if it makes any sense. Like, so you remember that I mean, the Wizards of the Coast people had one of these things, but there's also another paper that has like player types. And so the one that I'm thinking of has like killers and explorers and achievers and socializers.
Yeah.
I think is that matrix.
Yeah.
Um,
The playing card scheme that often it's like invoked in MMO contexts, like hearts, clubs,
yeah, right.
spades, and diamonds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I found it to be like an incredibly meaningful paper, and I oftentimes apply it to things like Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia,
Yep.
like, I think about Wikipedia like once a week, and I'm like, why was that so successful? And
Yeah.
one of my theories is actually it was like an incredibly well designed game because you've got the editors and the creators and the chatters and the tagger. Like no matter
Absolutely.
what your like quirk is, like there's something for you to just go deep on it. And then I've only played Dungeons and Dragons. I've had like part of a campaign that I was invited to, and it was fun to see my friends. And I think there was a lot of like mechanics, and so like I would hang out with them for like 2.5 hours, and that would be like plenty. That would be like mostly this skirmish with orcs.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, I'm not really wired that way. Like
Right.
I don't have a lust for battle mechanics.
Right.
I'm more like I like Knights of the Old Republic, the alignment stuff. Like
Mm-hmm.
I would love having like a lot of time in my player bio and then being faced like with really tough decisions of like, is this really what my character would do? Like,
Yeah.
I want to free the town, but maybe I have to like roll the dice, or like I like the conflict of sort of like this is my alignment, and then I'm faced with a difficult choice.
Yeah.
So that I'm not saying this fits perfectly into that. I actually think it doesn't fit at all. The point just being that like we all have our own proclivities. Like, do you think in a game, as you're designing this game from scratch and it's like very generative and has cards, like, do you think such a game itself could even incorporate all player types such that like the battle mechanics person is happy and the character personality person is happy and the lore world builder is happy? Or do you actually think it's kind of the responsibility of a game, at least call it like a D&D style game, of to be like, say, hey, like I'm planting my flag here, I'm story driven, I'm mechanics driven, and like hopefully you're cool with that. If not, don't play.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think like in this particular case, I am like really trying to make a game for me, my son, and my daughter, like, and these three people
Yeah.
who live in this house with like this context. And that's very freeing for this project to kind of just go like, I just need to meet the needs of these three people and nothing else, compared to working on a product with has like hundreds of millions of users or something, right? So with this most recent project, it's been very local in that way, in terms of like not thinking too far or too abstractly about like how this could work. But I have found already that there's sort of that's being forced in some ways, where there are like, if you just even with three people, that's enough to already start to reveal differences in how people want to spend their time playing. It is already too scoped towards like a game where you are on an adventure and there's challenges and there's enemies, like even the idea that having a weapon, right? Like it's just like there's an assumption of a weapon. But I think I want to keep basically creating card categories such that like the genres and things can just sort of like totally open up into to being lots of different to support lots of different things. And I think one of the big limits I'm not sure I can break out of without just doing something new, but I'm interested in, is doing things where you don't play as a character that you control. Like just even having an avatar in a world that's already a very thoroughly explored space in a lot of these RPGs. And I'm interested in RPGs where you play as like a group of people, or you play as like, maybe you play as the weather,
Right.
or maybe like I want to,
Yeah.
I want to. I've been dissatisfied with the mold of having to always think of ourselves as a band of adventurers, right?
Yeah, that's cool. I love that. I also think about the environments where I play D&D, and it's like, in my particular group, the wives don't really necessarily want to play. And
Yeah,
so they're in another room where they don't come at all. And like,
right.
but what would it look like to include them in a way that, I'm not saying like they have to have fun, but like when you said the weather, I'm like, yeah, I think I could like convince
Yeah,
my partner to like come through every once in a while and like blow and be like, it's windy, or,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I've gotten obsessed. Sorry, obsessed is the exact wrong word. I've gotten ensnared by an iPhone game. So I haven't played free to play games in a long time, and I just got lost in Marvel Strike Force.
don't know.
I mean, don't play it. It's like a generic free to play game, but just the state of the art and mechanics is incredible, and just in terms of like their methods of addiction. And one of the things that they do so well is there's a mode for every availability I have. So if I'm going to play for 15 minutes, which for me is a
Oh
lot, like
yeah,
I
right.
can do campaign mode and like advance the plot.
Yep.
If I'm in like the bathroom, I can like do a couple of blitz things and set on autoplay, right? And so
Yeah,
instead of choosing each character's actions, I do autoplay. And then there's simulate, where they won't even go into the battlefield. It'll just sort of run the numbers.
yeah,
And so, and there might even be two or three other modes. And so they've completely opened up the game where like, no matter what I mean, I could be talking to you right now and like be simulating
right.
on the side. And I can totally see the path where someone who gets really addicted would be doing that, right? Because it's like,
Yep.
I can actually fill up every crack in my life with this game in some way. So, I mean, there's kind of a nefarious part to that. But clearly like game designers are thinking about this more and more. Whereas like, I think a free to play game 10 years ago, I'm sure this is like, I don't have my fingers on the pulse of this stuff, but like Farmville probably had a pretty primitive version of that where
Yeah.
you couldn't necessarily fill up every moment in your life.
Yeah, and I actually think there are a lot of outside of free to play. I think there's lots of great examples of that being a really wonderful experience. Some things that come to mind are, as maybe it's slightly different, but I think that there's a relationship. Have you played Everything by David O'Reilly?
I haven't.
Yeah, so it's like one of the things that made it stood out to me is that if you put the controller down, this is a game where you can control everything, is the scheme. So let's say you start as a cow, and then you can kind of transfer your control into a tree, and then you can transfer that control into a mountain, and then I'll control the planet. You can go the other way where you can kind of increasingly control small things. And so the idea is kind of like a interactive powers of 10 type experience, right? But the basic conceit is amazing, but then what I really was struck by is if you put the controller down, the game will just take control for you and
Mm,
start to play the game for you.
mm,
And it's close enough to you playing it that it's actually like a really amazing alternative to playing it, where you can just sit on the couch and watch it. And it's like it's a very it's psychedelic imagery, and there's like literally Alan Watts quotes littered throughout the game, and so
yeah.
there's a very natural context for just sort of like letting the vibe of the game wash over you. But that feeling of like I can reach in and take as much control or as little control as I want. Rainbow Six is another game. I don't know if you've
Oh
gotten to
yeah,
Rainbow
Rainbow
Six
Six.
games.
Yeah.
I really love just like plotting out a mission and then
Right.
just hitting play and just letting
Right.
the AI do everything for me.
Yeah.
But then sometimes I like to take control over a character and might be in there myself. But I like that ability to kind of slide in and out of like the levels of abstraction of the world.
I totally remember that. I think it might have been the first Rainbow Six game also had that mode. And just being like so struck by the ability to like be the technical
Yeah.
person, and like you didn't have to play the game. On the other hand, you could like kind of skip the plan a little bit and just sort of like gun in there. So we're coming up on the hour. I did want to ask you something though. Oh, actually, I wanted to inform you something. Did you ever play that little iOS game that I created called Pablo? There was like one line drawings.
Yeah, I did.
Just makes me remember that that game also had this mode, which was, I thought it was so interesting. And the game, like I needed more like time
Yeah.
into it. So it was like badly executed, but it was a game where you had one line drawing. So you press your finger on the screen, you draw something, and as soon as you release it, it uploads. So there's no like done button. It's just releasing your finger sends it to the feed. But then it had this other mode of infinite drawing where it basically connected everybody's drawing. So it was a
Yeah.
single constant one line viewing experience. And it's just, yeah, I was like so struck by those pivots on the data,
Yeah.
it's a good
Yeah.
point. Like it doesn't have to be, um, I guess for me, what that moment represented was sort of this connectivity
Yeah.
between members that was completely surprising, right? It wasn't like I follow you or you follow me or I like your thing or you like
Yeah.
my thing. It was connectivity through this completely like alien generation. And I like the idea of that, independent of however it was executed.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
Um,
I'm also not on a timeline. So
oh, okay, cool. Well, I've got baby duties in a minute. How old are your kids again?
9 and 5.
9 and 5. And do you find like, is it just super fun to like play a game with them? And you've got like these two players who have like completely different worldviews. Like, I don't know what, like, just, is it, what do you notice when you're playing with them?
Yeah, I think especially lately, there's a greater divergence between like how they approach games. My son is increasingly playing Fortnite with his like
Oh,
friends, and so competition is like becoming more front and center in his experience. I think he grew up on Minecraft and Roblox and a lot of open-ended, non-challenge based, non-competition based games, which I think is beautiful. That's an option relative to our childhoods, where
yeah.
most games were brutal challenges or highly competitive. And only now, as he kind of gets into, he's 9, turning 10 soon, you start to shift into a different kind of like approach puberty. You know, you start to get, I think competition starts to motivate more, and I think like teasing and like prodding each other a bit can also kind of is becoming more naturally to him, whereas before they were a bit closer in terms of like he's not quite old enough to be jocular. So that's been a new phenomenon I've had to grapple with, was his interest in being increasingly jocular, and she's still young.
Yeah.
But that is it is the kind of background for a lot of the design choices, where he can handle math, but she's too young to handle math. So how do you kind of strip out the math from an RPG, right? So there is a kind of constant balancing of like what's going to work for all of them. A lot of times a game is fun for 2 of the 3 of us, but it's very rare to find something that's fun for all 3.
Yeah. You're making me, first of all, you made me think of Counter-Strike in my own childhood.
Yeah.
As sort of this, like, did you play it all?
Yeah, huge. It's one of the biggest games of my life, I would say.
What's your relationship to Counter-Strike now in terms of like, from that, that's a part of who I am. And it was an interesting phase to like curse the day that I played that game, to, I don't know, to maybe another endpoint of like, I made a lot of great friends and I developed great hand-eye control.
Yeah, I mean, I did make a lot of great friends. It was a really important environment for a lot of my relationships, both in the real world and also kind of burgeoning internet identity relationships. And I look back on those times like very fondly. And I wish that I had the space to take a game as seriously as I did when I was playing that game. I played StarCraft 2, I think, that seriously, and that was like right before my son was born. But just ever since having kids, I haven't found a context for deciding to get good at something like really seriously and just driving to get really good at it. But with a set of friends who you have to learn how to coordinate with, there's not a greater high for me than you and a few really close friends completely like nailing the execution of like a plan in a game like that.
Yeah.
And I think my sense is that experience is mostly found now through Fortnite and battle royale games, where you kind of are forced into this like coordinative squad. But they don't scratch the itch for me in the same way.
Thank you, because you've moved my feelings of Counter-Strike a little bit. Like it sounds like to me, like, so I have a very negative relationship with Counter-Strike. I played it not as much as my friends, but my friends who played it more, I was like, ugh. And it's just so repetitive. It just had this mindless grinding quality of like, I don't know the map that well, and I will pretty consistently kill the people who know the map less well than me and be killed by the people who know it better than me. And then I might get killed right away, and then I'll like, I'm gonna play again, or
Yeah.
I'll have to pass to my friend. And teabagging. I remember
Yeah.
teabagging a lot and spraying the graffiti. And so it stressed me out. It felt very like linear and repetitive and grindy.
Totally.
And it was involving murder and terrorism. But I think the part that I never got to, and my friend group never got to, but I can imagine being quite powerful, is the coordination and the strategy.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about how games might pull that out earlier. I don't know, for instance, Fortnite, maybe my mental model is like, I'm imagining in my head like this onboarding flow of Counter-Strike, and like being a somewhat badly designed game, like many people got lost in the place that
Yeah.
I'm at.
Yep.
And what it might look like if a game is better at that, such that like coordination is kind of a must-have from the beginning, and the grindy thing gets like so boring or so just like not worthwhile fast enough that you end up having to sort of develop the teamwork and coordination sooner. I mean, maybe Fortnite's already doing that. I don't know.
Yeah, I do think that's laced through the dynamics of battle royale in a way that makes it pretty well suited. Like the pacing. Have you played any of these games?
Mm-mm.
So I think one thing to distinguish it from Counter-Strike is the matches are much longer, assuming that you live beyond a kind of average length, and the pace is very slow, and it's rare that you encounter other people, and then it's like the odds of you encountering other people kind of like ramp up and up and up as the kind of match closes, because the circle is closing in on you. And it's all forcing you towards one common point, right?
Oh, interesting.
And so the natural rhythm in a friendship, what makes it really, I think, such a great fit for friendship is there's like this downtime where you can just bullshit on the audio call and just catch up and gossip and do whatever, and kind of be relatively silly. But then sort of the game sort of forces tension on you progressively over time, and then you kind of get into a focus mode, and you get to kind of take the coordination more seriously, and then it kind of like you get really engaged, and then there's like a big pop, either you win or you lose, and then there's a kind of like a you wash, and then you kind of go back in, and it's chill again, right? You're not carrying the stress, because now you're back into a kind of a downtime mode. And so that rhythm, I think, has been part of what makes those games so captivating. It's such a good way to express friendship, where there's like this downtime where you can relax, but then you can also display the coordination of like really, if you want to, go down that. But I know that a lot of I've played with younger players and teenagers and stuff, and a lot of times they'll completely ignore the primary objective and just kind of go explore or talk or whatever. And so there is a gradation of how much you kind of need to care. Whereas Counter-Strike is, I think, brutal if you're not interested in improving as a team.
Sounds like that's a game that perfectly embodies these four suits of players. It sounds like there's socializers. The end of that paper I find particularly interesting, because it talks about stable dynamics. Because one of the ways that like the information will flow, if not checked, is everyone becomes a socializer. So it sort of sounds like there's an aspect of that, right, where it's like whatever it is, it becomes the water cooler. So how do you ensure that there are just enough achievers, killers, and world builders or explorers to kind of keep that happening? And I can imagine this I'm trying to describe what I'm doing with my hands, like shrinking of the world space, kind of keeping the socializers in check, and also maybe not, right? Like you can still socialize but then you're sort of like out of the game a little bit. So I want to close with a question for you that I don't even know if it's a question, but when you're describing Counter-Strike, it kind of came into my head. Is Counter-Strike the opposite of cards? And then, so the question is like, what is the opposite of cards? Cards is such like a rich paradigm for me that has all sorts of meaning. Like, what is there an opposite that comes to my mind or your mind of like, what is the antithesis of that?
Yeah, I mean, Counter-Strike immediately bounces off of me as like the right selection there, particularly contemporary Counter-Strike, where a very significant amount of what happens in that game is the gun economy, like the skin economy, where like a large part of what you're doing is like opening packs of like, random assortments of like high to low value things and like trading them and everything like that. So they've folded in increasingly card-like qualities into Counter-Strike over time, in recognition of the kind of the power of cards. I think part of me wants to start to taxonomize like the qualities of cards, right? What makes cards card-like, and then start to carve off like what is its opposite. But I don't want to stretch this out. It's probably another 1 hour call to sort of fully unpack like the full import of the card.
I mean, worlds are not cards. So like, again, I haven't played Minecraft, but that feels uncard like.
Yeah,
In,
that
in a,
I
in a,
think that does feel safely on card like.
it doesn't feel like the polar opposite. It does feel like maybe there's some nodes where like there's clearly got to be something very linear that is also not card like.
Yeah, I think if we're staying within the realm of games as the kind of analogy, I think if you think of maybe like a Last of Us or something like that, and Uncharted, like these like hyper linear roller coaster games where you know exactly what you're going to get. There's never surprises. There's like everyone gets the same experience. I think that homogeneity and the absence of surprise, zero scarcity, no specialness, to be
Mm-hmm.
found anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
That all feels very like anti-card to me. And
Yeah.
I can't get into those games at all. And I think there's a relationship there.
So maybe we'll try to. I don't want to prematurely create a taxonomy. I agree. This is not the place and the time for that. But like, and I also don't know how fun this is as an exercise. Like, it doesn't currently like spark much for me. But like, you can kind of imagine like there's completely open world, infinite exploration. We'll never know what you're doing here. I'm kind of sticking with games, but you can imagine interfaces that are world like too.
Yeah.
Uh, where like a decision tree or forking paths is meaningless, because like you wouldn't be able to create so many paths. And then there's like a linear, which is like one path. And then cards, which is interesting, is like they maybe are the best interface for forking paths that are like
Yeah.
incredibly rich and fertile, and at the same time finite, or if not finite, like sort of uh, like not unboundedly infinite, like the small kind of infinite.
Yeah.
And that really gets so much excitement around completion, right? Or like having walked all the paths,
Yep.
knowing the path. So it sort of sits between these, and like in a way that also feels very fertile. It's not just between them, but it also sort of does things for you.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point that I didn't appreciate until you walked through it. There is like the card is kind of also a promise of encapsulation, right?
Mm.
And but then there's the reconfigurability of them that allows them to kind of support a, a shockingly high amount of complexity while still also kind of staying within the realm of the card as this one governing paradigm for the structure of everything. And that diversity of what cards can do is probably displayed on just like looking at the tremendous amount of games that are created with cards, especially this most recent wave of reinterest in cards. Like, have you played
Mm.
Slay the Spire?
No.
Yeah, I think people I think are there. It's interesting to see how people bring the card metaphor into software, where there's no need to be bound by the laws of physics of cards, and yet there's a value to invoking
Right.
the card metaphor, right? So there's definitely, I think, a reinterest in that.
Hmm. David, thank you for coming on the Barcast. It was a treat.
Thank you. It was really fun.
We'll have you on a future episode where you can demo the game that you're prototyping now. And do you have any interest in doing that, or are you like how much are you thinking truly this is just for me and my kids, and then how much are you like I can already imagine the box art.
Yeah, I think it's if it's not fun with the kids, it's there's no interest in going more general than that. But if it is really fun with the kids and it sticks, it
Yeah.
seems like it would be hard to not spread or share with people.
Yes.
So I think it's them first, and then we'll see where it goes from there.
Cool. Well, sign me up for a playtest.
Cool.
Thanks for coming on. I'll see
All
you
right.
see you around.